Okay, let's start with the 10:30 morning briefing here for Hurricane Laura. Laura is now a Category 3 hurricane. It's strengthened quite a bit since yesterday. Forecast to be a Category 4 at landfall. We've got more and more confidence of a track up along the Texas-Louisiana border, give or take a little bit there. Still getting impacts on the left-hand side of that track across southeast Texas, but not as severe as they'll see up in the Beaumont-Port Arthur area on east across Louisiana, where conditions look very severe over there. So let's go ahead and dive into the details. Here's a look at Hurricane Laura. You can see that eye, very classic hurricane structure there. Forecast to intensify further before landfall. It looks like the slides may not be moving again. Is that correct? Can someone confirm that you're seeing slide 2? Okay, it looks like yesterday you can see slide 2. It just might be a little bit slow. For the other organizers, if you came in as a panelist, you won't be able to see questions, but we'll get that squared away before too long. You can see the hurricane there over the Gulf. Extremely dangerous, deadly storm. Tremendous amount of wind and surge flooding near and to the right of the track. It looks like that forecast is going to be east of us, though, so we'll be on the western fringe. Still expecting at least tropical storm force winds with hurricane force wind gusts, especially possible still over our eastern zones closer to the track of the hurricane. You can see the forecast track here. I'll have a little bit better slide for this when we send out the slides, a little bit more zoomed in. You can see that rapid motion once it does make landfall, actually re-emerging out over the mid-Atlantic coast in just about 4 days. But you can see the cone there pretty much centered on the Texas-Louisiana border. So, you know, places like High Island and Chambers County, you're still awfully close to the track of this storm. And those are the areas that have the greatest chance of seeing hurricane force winds. But the most severe impacts do still look to be to our east. But again, a stronger storm, Category 4. I think we were calling for a Category 3 yesterday. Intensity at landfall 145 miles per hour now. Forecast gusting to 170. And one thing, impacts are felt well outside the cone. This is a good example of that. You see most of Louisiana is now outside the cone, but those surge impacts are going to be extremely severe all across the Louisiana coast. Here's a look at the wind-related warnings. You see kind of the brighter color red over our eastern zone. So talking about Chambers, Liberty, Polk, and even Galveston County. Those areas are still in a hurricane warning. The farther east you are, the greater your chance of seeing hurricane force winds. And then notice that threat extends well inland. So this is a fast-moving, high-category storm. When in these situations, we expect wind damage to occur well inland because the hurricane doesn't have time to decay. And then tropical storm force warnings in the darker shade of red. That's from Brazoria up to Houston County, even over to Madison County. The farther west you are, the lower the risk of winds. So as the day goes on, we may be making some slight adjustments on the western side of this, where the threat looks less. Storm surge related warnings, not too much change from yesterday. Even though we're on the left-hand side, we will see elevated tides, just not as high as they would be if we were closer to the center or to the right. So we'll dive into values, surge values next. But the surge for areas east of us and not far east of us really looks to be life-threatening, deadly, almost unsurvivable. They're talking now, Hurricane Center, about 12 to 18 feet above ground level in some of those areas for the Louisiana coast. Flash flood watch, this is the same as yesterday. Again, east of our area, with the hurricane making that more eastern track, we're really not looking at any kind of rainfall amounts that we can't handle. So we're not expecting flash flooding at this time. Of course, we'll have to monitor the storm as it comes in, any bands on the western flank. But right now, we're not thinking that flash flooding will be an issue. Here's the relative risk here. Wind and surge, moderate. And I've heard that the audio is in and out, so we'll keep our fingers crossed on that. Wind and surge, moderate. Rainfall and river flooding, slight. If that storm tracks as we think, probably won't be an issue for us. Tornadoes, more of an issue near and right of the track in the spiral bands, and we're on the left side, so we don't think tornadoes are going to be a significant issue. And then a big marine issue, we've gotten reports from offshore buoys of 35-foot seas and 115 knot winds. So, very, very rough seas out in the marine area. Some of that wave energy is entering our coastal waters right now. Here's a look at the wind probabilities for 58-mile-per-hour sustained winds. And you can see the focus really is on far east Texas and much of southwest Louisiana. For the Houston-Galveston area proper, we're kind of on the fringe, and these are strong tropical storm force winds. But you get the picture here that the greater chance of strong tropical storm force winds, the kind of winds where we can lose power, for example, is really greater as you go farther east. So again, thinking Chambers, Liberty counties, Bolivar Peninsula, and then as we get west of there, not seeing those high winds. Probability of hurricane force winds. Once again, you see the focus is on southwest Louisiana, perhaps over to far east Texas, where we have chances of hurricane force sustained winds greater than 50%. And then as we get toward Galveston Bay, those chances drop quite a bit. So it gives you a sense that if we do make changes later in the day to those hurricane warnings, we may be shaving a little bit on the west side, but we have to still watch the storm and its track before that happens. And then I'll have a little bit better graphic, more zoomed in for the send-out slides. But this hasn't changed a whole lot. Still expecting those tropical storm force winds to arrive this evening or perhaps early tonight on our Texas coastline. So maybe it has slowed just a shade from what we briefed yesterday. Here's a look kind of at general storm surge values along the coastal areas regionally. And you see 2 to 4 feet from Freeport around Galveston Bay all the way down to Port Bolivar. Still carrying 6 to 9 feet for Bolivar Peninsula and on east to Sea-Rim State Park. And then you can see the values even higher. Sea-Rim State Park to Johnson Bayou, 10 to 15 feet. Johnson Bayou over to Rockefeller Wildlife Refuge, 15 to 20 feet. So, and this is above ground level. So very, very concerning forecast values here. Really unsurvivable for people in those areas. So that's what we're dealing with not too far to our east. For our forecast area, it looks like the highest surge values and wave impacts will be Bolivar Peninsula, and then lower surge impacts farther to the southwest. The Surge inundation maps, again, these are considered realistic, kind of worst case, but they don't really account for wave action, so I just want to caution you a little bit. But from the surge alone, we're looking at more like a 1 to 3 foot contribution over Bolivar, and even lesser amounts for the island and the Bay areas. So because it's tracking to our east, not seeing direct surge impacts per se as much. And we'll talk more about the wave impacts in a moment. Here's a little bit of more of a zoom in where you might see some high water from storm surge on Bolivar and in Chambers County. The blue areas are 1 to 3 foot of surge. And then just some very low-lying bay areas there on Galveston Island. So quite a bit different than what we looked at yesterday with the track further east and higher confidence in that track. It's not surprising that these values have come down. Talking about the seas offshore, we have, like I said, had a report this morning of 35-foot seas off the Louisiana coast. And if you look at the forecast here, the left-hand frame is from this morning. You can see that bullseye there of 30 foot or greater showing up in the wave model. And that wave energy is starting to be felt at our offshore buoys. We're getting long period swell, which carries a lot of wave energy. So we would expect the surf to really ramp up at our beaches today, starting now, really. Some of that wave energy should be reaching our shoreline any moment. So you'll see higher surf. You'll see the water levels come up from an effect called wave run-up and setup. And that's what's going to boost our water levels primarily. Water carried by those waves, essentially. And then I want to show you a time series from a different surge model. And don't focus too much on the numbers here, but it does give you an idea of what we're looking at as far as time frame and surge and water levels. And I'm showing here Galveston Bay entrance. So think of this as the Gulf side tides. And what you see this morning, we're a little bit right of the right line, and we're not really going to drop off a whole lot from where we are now on our next low tide. And then the high tide tonight is the tide of concern. Now, these times are in Greenwich time, so you have to subtract 5 hours. So bottom line is along about for the high tide late this evening and tonight will be our tide of concern. Our highest water levels in the Weather Service, we primarily use relative to mean high water. So this is giving us values up in the 4 to 5 foot range for that. Many EMs use relative to mean low water, so this might be more familiar to you. And this is showing values 5.5 to perhaps as high as 7 feet on that scale. So for many of y'all, you know that we start to see issues around 4 feet. So that's consistent with the surge maps I showed earlier that we still do have a high coastal flooding concern, even though we're on the left side. This is for Eagle Point, so for those communities along the bay. Likewise, we do expect the next high tide occurring tonight to be the high tide of concern. Relative to mean high water, again, this is what we normally use, 3 to 4 feet. But for those of you that are more used to mean low water, 4 to 5 feet is kind of a general sense. The values may be a little different than that, but it gives you that idea that tonight is when the high tide of concern will be, where your low-lying areas could be flooded. And then one more thing I want to mention is the north-facing beaches along the barrier islands, the bay side, basically, of Bolivar and Galveston Island. As the storm pulls away, our winds will become northerly, and at that time, we could see some water piling up on the bay side of Galveston Island and Bolivar Peninsula on the north-facing beaches. Why is that? Well, the water rises ahead of the storm, and then that water gets pulled back south on the backside as the winds shift to the north. So we're actually seeing that in this wave model. Note the peak around 12 Greenwich time, which is about 7 a.m. So the high tide around sunrise tomorrow or tomorrow morning it will be the time of concern for that area. Again, on the backside of the storm. So this model shows that very well. And just some text here kind of describing what we've just been talking about. The elevated tide levels for us due to this wave run-up and setup phenomenon. So I won't read all this, but you'll have this in your slides. Rainfall forecast. This looks pretty similar to yesterday. The heavier rains just to our east with the track of the storm. Like every other hazard, the threat is going to be greatest for our eastern counties, Chambers, Bolivar, Liberty County, and so on. But the heaviest rains do look to be east. For like Galveston and Houston, maybe 2 to 4 inches. As you get west of 45, lower than that. So that's why flash flooding is not nearly as big a concern. I did put in the sort of tornado threat here, and again, with the track of the storm to our east, we're in what's called general thunder, not really expecting any tornadoes from this hurricane being this far on the left-hand side. So just to sum up, looking at very severe impacts not too far to our east, extremely dangerous winds and deadly storm surge. The other hazards likewise appear to be greater to our east, but we still are expecting some high winds and storm surge due to primarily the high surf being generated by the storm and coming onto our coastline. And then we still have those wind-related warnings and surge warnings in effect. Not too much change in those areas from yesterday. As the storm starts to pull away, we'll start to trim back those warnings later today or tonight. So our confidence is higher of the storm track, of the storm intensity, and the impacts for our area based on the more eastern scenario compared to some of the others we were concerned about in previous days. And we still will get impacts over the next 24 hours. So just need to be aware of that, even though the storm is traveling just to our east. Okay, we will actually do one more webinar at 4:30